Hello everyone. Before we dive into this shocking new update, I'm curious. Where are you tuning in from and what time is it for you right now? Share your location and time in the comments. Today's story comes straight from a prison nurse, revealing what really happened to Diddy after a mysterious injection. Let's get started. Chapter 1. He didn't look like a mogul anymore. I've been working in this prison for 6 years. Seen all kinds of men come through. Some scared, some arrogant, some already broken before they even set foot inside. Celebrities, big-shot criminals, politicians who fell from grace. They all think they're different. They all think they won't crack. But Diddy? I wasn't sure what to make of him yet. I'd heard the whispers before I even saw him. The guards talked in half-jokes and side glances, throwing around words like fragile and not built for this. Inmates, the ones who didn't care about his money or fame, had already started their own stories. Man's melting away, ain't eating, just sits there like he's somewhere else. They got him messed up. I didn't put much stock in inmate gossip, but I'll be honest, I was curious. I'd treated some high-profile guys before, and most of them still carried that air of importance around them. Even in their lowest moments, they had this pride, this refusal to be seen as weak. But when they finally broke, you could see it in their eyes. I didn't expect to see that look the first time Diddy stepped into the medical unit. He didn't walk in, he was escorted, flanked by 2 guards like they expected him to collapse at any second. I noticed his hands first. Thin, trembling slightly, as if even the weight of his cuffs was too much. Then his face. That face wasn't the face of the man from TV. Gone was the smooth, polished confidence he used to have. His cheeks were hollow, his skin paler than I expected, like he hadn't been outside in months. Maybe he hadn't. His eyes were the worst part, sunken in, dark circles so deep it looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Not just tired, haunted. He moved slow, like every step took effort. I glanced at the guards. One of them, a tall guy with a scar running from his cheek to his jaw, looked away when I made eye contact. The other one, younger, shifted on his feet like he didn't want to be here. That was my first sign something was off. I gestured toward the chair. "Go ahead and sit, Mr. Combs." He didn't respond right away, didn't even react to his own name, just stood there for a second, blinking slow, like he was trying to process that I was talking to him. Then, without a word, he lowered himself onto the chair. Even the way he sat was strange. Not stiff, not relaxed, just exhausted, like a man holding onto the last bit of his energy just to keep himself from falling apart. "You're here for dizziness?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He nodded, barely. "And nausea?" Another slow nod. I grabbed my clipboard, jotting down the symptoms. "When did it start?" For the first time, he spoke. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in a while. "I don't know." "How often does it happen?" A pause. Then, "All the time." I looked up. His eyes were focused somewhere past me, like I wasn't even in the room. Detached. I ran through the usual checks: pulse, blood pressure, temperature, the basics. Everything was slightly off, but not extreme enough to set off alarms. But then, I checked his weight. I frowned. "When was your last medical evaluation?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. The younger guard cleared his throat. "About a month ago?" I looked at the numbers again. That wasn't right. Diddy had lost at least 15, maybe 20 pounds in 4 weeks. That was a lot, even for someone dealing with stress, even for someone who wasn't eating properly. I glanced at his arms, too thin. The skin near his wrists was marked with faint bruises, like he'd been gripping something too tight. Or, "Do you get lightheaded when you stand?" I asked. A slow nod. "Any sharp pains?" Another nod. "Any history of—" Then he muttered something. It was low, almost a whisper, but I caught it. A name. Not mine, not the guards. A name I didn't recognize. I paused, pen hovering over the paper. What was that? His lips parted slightly, like he was about to repeat it, but then he looked at the guards, and they looked back at him. I caught it then, that tiny flicker of something in his expression, not just fear, something deeper, something he wasn't supposed to say. The younger guard shifted, nervous. The older one? Blank face, like he was used to hearing things he wasn't supposed to react to. I knew better than to push it. Instead, I kept writing. Any medications you've taken recently? Diddy blinked, slow. Then, for the first time, he looked directly at me and said they gave me something that made me pause. Who did? He hesitated, then just as he was about to answer, the older guard stepped forward. That's enough for now. I turned to him. Excuse me? Is good. The guard didn't even look at me. His tone wasn't aggressive, but final. I glanced at Diddy. He was staring at the floor now, hands clasped together, face unreadable. I set my clipboard down. Look, I just need a few more. You heard me. I clenched my jaw, but I didn't push it, because I knew. I knew when a medical case was being shut down. The older guard stepped behind Diddy, giving him a silent signal to stand. Diddy obeyed without hesitation. And that was the strangest part. No protest, no frustration, just quiet acceptance. Like he wasn't even in control of himself anymore. As they led him out, I watched his back, memorizing the way he moved. The slow, hollow steps, the way his shoulders hunched inward, like he was folding into himself. A man who once stood at the top of the world now looked like a ghost. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if he was sick, scared, or both. I just knew something wasn't right. Chapter 2. The next morning, I arrived at the medical unit early, still unsettled by what had happened with Diddy the day before. Something about him had stuck with me, in a way no other inmate ever had. It wasn't just the weight loss or the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. It was the way he had looked at me. Like he wanted to say something, but there were hands wrapped around his throat, squeezing the words out of him before they could escape. I had dealt with sick inmates before. I had dealt with pretenders too, guys who faked symptoms for painkillers or a cushy stay in the infirmary. But something about Diddy's condition felt wrong, and that name he muttered, I hadn't forgotten it. It sat in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. As soon as I walked into the unit, one of the clerks handed me a file, her face unreadable. Routine health check, she said, sliding the paperwork across the desk. I took the folder and flipped it open, scanning the order inside. It was brief, too brief. Made comms. Routine evaluation. Administration approved injection. That was it. I frowned. Injections weren't standard procedure. Unless an inmate had a diagnosed condition, medication wasn't just administered without clear medical necessity. Even then, it had to be approved by the prison's medical team, with documentation of what was being given and why. But this had no details, no medication name, no explanation, just a signature from someone in administration. I checked the signature. It wasn't from the prison doctor. It was someone higher up. Something in my gut twisted. I flipped the file closed and turned to the clerk. Who approved this? She hesitated for half a second too long. Orders came from administration, she said, voice flat. Yeah, I see that, I said, holding the file up. But what's in the injection? She didn't answer. I stared at her, waiting. Finally, she sighed and leaned in a little. Look, I just processed the orders, okay? If you got questions, talk to the supervisor. That was all I needed to hear. I left the medical desk and went straight down the hallway to find Supervisor Green, a man I had never particularly liked but tolerated because I had to. He was ex-military, built like a stone pillar, and had the personality of one too. He ran the medical unit with a no-nonsense, don't-ask-questions attitude, and if there was one person who might know what the hell was going on, it was him. I knocked on his office door once before pushing it open without waiting for a response. Green looked up from his paperwork, annoyed. "You forget how doors work." I tossed the file onto his desk. "What's this about?" He didn't even look at it, just leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple like I was already giving him a headache. "It's a routine check." "Bullshit," I said before I could stop myself. "Routine checks don't come with mystery injections signed off by admin." Green stared at me for a long second. I didn't blink. Then he exhaled, running a hand over his bald head before muttering, "Just follow the orders. It's above your pay grade." That didn't sit right with me. I crossed my arms. Since when do we blindly follow orders without knowing what we're giving inmates? He leaned forward, eyes sharp now. "Since always, this ain't your first day here. You do the job, you keep your mouth shut, and you move on." His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. A warning. I gritted my teeth, but I knew pushing further wouldn't get me anywhere. I wasn't stupid. I knew what happened to staff who asked too many questions about things they weren't supposed to. I took the file and left his office, feeling the paranoia creep in. This wasn't just some routine checkup. Something was happening, and no one wanted to talk about it. Diddy came in an hour later. This time, he wasn't dragging his feet like before. If anything, he looked more agitated. His hands twitched against his cuffs. His lips moved, whispering something to himself that I couldn't quite hear. He kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone to be following him. I guided him to the chair. "How are you feeling today?" He didn't answer. I moved around the room, setting up the syringe, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind screamed at me to slow down. I needed to ask questions, but I also knew I was already in dangerous territory. As I pulled the cap off the syringe, Diddy finally spoke. "They're trying to erase me." I froze. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight behind it made my stomach drop. I turned to him slowly. "Who is?" He didn't answer, just stared straight ahead. I swallowed hard and prepped the needle, heart pounding in my chest. The guards were watching. I could feel their eyes on me. There was no way out of this. I had to go through with it. I pressed the syringe to his arm. His breathing hitched, his fingers twitched. Then the needle went in. The plunger depressed, the liquid entering his bloodstream. The second it was done, something shifted. His breathing slowed instantly. His muscles stiffened. Just for a moment. Then, his whole body relaxed, too quickly, too completely. His head rolled slightly to the side, his eyes fluttering as if he was about to pass out. I watched him carefully. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't say anything. Not with the guards standing there. Not when I knew I was already in too deep. Whatever they had just given him, it wasn't medicine. And something told me that by the time I figured out what it would already be too late. Chapter 3. The symptoms no one could explain. For the first few hours after the injection, nothing seemed too out of the ordinary. Diddy had been sluggish before, and the sudden relaxation after the shot could have just been a side effect. But something about the way his body loosened too quickly, too completely, stuck with me. His breathing had slowed almost unnaturally. His limbs had gone limp in the chair. It wasn't the normal response I'd seen when giving inmates routine medication. Still, I told myself I was overthinking it. The prison was full of stories, full of paranoia. Sometimes inmates played up their illnesses trying to get moved somewhere safer, somewhere more comfortable. Maybe that was all this was. Then, as the first day after the injection passed, I started realizing that whatever had been put into Diddy's bloodstream, it wasn't routine, and it sure as hell wasn't harmless. The next morning, I saw him again. He was escorted in by the same 2 guards, but this time, something was different. He wasn't walking properly. His steps were uneven, his right foot dragging slightly as he moved. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion, maybe stiffness from spending too much time sitting in his cell. But as he got closer, I saw the way his shoulders slumped unnaturally forward, like his body was struggling to hold itself up. His eyes looked even worse than before. The dark circles had deepened, his pupils slightly dilated. He kept blinking, slow, unfocused, like someone who was just waking up from a deep sleep but wasn't fully present yet. I guided him to the chair again, and for the first time, I noticed a hesitation in his movements. He seemed confused, like he wasn't entirely sure why he was there. "Diddy," I said carefully, watching his face. "How are you feeling today?" He didn't respond right away. He just stared at the floor, lips slightly parted, breathing shallow. I repeated the question. Finally, his gaze lifted to meet mine, and for a split second, his expression was blank, like he didn't recognize me. I swallowed hard, pushing down the unease creeping up my spine. "Do you remember why you're here?" Again, a delay, then a slow shake of his head. That wasn't normal. I glanced at the guards, but they gave me the same look as before. Impassive, unreadable. "You're in the medical unit," I told him, speaking gently but firmly. "You came in yesterday, do you remember that?" He blinked. Another long pause, then, barely above a whisper, "Yesterday?" It wasn't just confusion, it was real disorientation. I felt my pulse pick up. I'd worked with neurological patients before, people who had suffered strokes, traumatic brain injuries. This was similar, but it didn't make sense. There was nothing in his file about past neurological conditions, no previous head injuries, no history of memory loss. Something was happening to him, and I had a sinking feeling it had everything to do with that damn injection. By the second day, the decline was more obvious. I caught glimpses of him during meal distribution, and what I saw wasn't good. He was moving slower, more uncertain. His hands shook slightly when he reached for his tray, and at one point he set it down on the wrong table, only realizing when another inmate snapped at him. Even then, he didn't react how I expected. No arrogance, no flash of anger, just confusion, like he couldn't figure out how he had made the mistake in the first place. When he was escorted back into medical later that day, I took a more thorough look at him. His speech was slightly slurred now, just enough that someone unfamiliar with him might not catch it, but I did. His reflexes were slower, his ability to focus noticeably weaker. "Tell me your full name," I asked. He hesitated, then said, "Sean." "And your last name?" Another pause, longer this time. "Bones." I frowned, noting the delay. "What's your date of birth?" He opened his mouth, then stopped. I saw something flicker across his face. Frustration, fear. He was struggling to remember. A man who had spent decades in the public eye, who had probably rattled off his birth date to journalists, executives, security officers 100 times, and now he couldn't say it? I wrote down my observations, my pen pressing too hard against the paper. When I looked up, his hands were clenched into fists. "And me," he whispered. I stiffened. "What is?" "They put it in me." His eyes darted toward the guard standing by the door, and for the first time I saw real terror in his expression. I lowered my voice. "Diddy, what did they put in you?" His mouth opened slightly, but then suddenly, his body tensed. He jerked upright in the chair, muscles going rigid, his face twisting in discomfort. His breath hitched, his fingers twitching as if he was fighting against some invisible force. I reached for him instinctively, checking his pulse, but he jerked away, shaking his head. His whole body was betraying him. It lasted only seconds, But when it passed, he looked drained. I clenched my jaw, heart hammering. This wasn't stress. This wasn't hunger or exhaustion. Something was happening inside his body. By the end of the 48 hours, it was undeniable. Diddy was losing himself. I checked his medical records again, hoping to find some clue, some history that would explain this. But his chart was normal. Too normal. There was nothing about pre-existing conditions, no previous cognitive issues, which meant this wasn't natural. Something was causing it. I brought it up to Green, the supervisor, even though I already knew what he was going to say. He's showing signs of neurological impairment, I told him, trying to keep my voice calm. Slurred speech, memory issues, difficulty with motor function. That doesn't just happen overnight without cause. Green barely looked up from his paperwork. Not your concern. Actually, it is, if an inmate's condition is declining. Just do your job. My hands tightened into fists. Oh, what did they give him? I asked, my voice lower now. Green finally looked up. What part of not your concern are you struggling with? Something in his tone sent a cold chill down my spine. It wasn't just dismissive. It was a warning. A part of me wanted to push further, wanted to demand answers, but the logical part of my brain was screaming at me to back off. I forced myself to breathe. Diddy's health was failing, and no one was willing to talk about it. That meant only one thing. They already knew what was happening, and they didn't want anyone stopping it. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way his hands had trembled, the way his voice had faltered, the look in his eyes when he said, "They put it in me." I kept hearing the small, stuttering gaps in his sentences, the way he had struggled to find words that should have been second nature. Something was happening to him, and if I didn't figure it out soon, I had a feeling he wouldn't last long enough for me to get an answer. Chapter 4. Whispers in the hallway. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I knew it the moment I watched Diddy struggle to stand, his muscles weak, his eyes unfocused like a man who had been drugged past recognition. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't stress. This wasn't even prison breaking him down. This was something else. And yet, nobody seemed concerned. Nobody asked questions. Not the guards who escorted him to the medical unit. Not the officers in charge of keeping the records. Not even the warden, who had to have seen the reports. Diddy was deteriorating right in front of everyone's eyes, and the only person who seemed to care was me. So I did something I probably shouldn't have. I started asking around. At first, I kept it casual. I wasn't about to walk up to a guard and say, "Hey, did y'all poison this man?" That's the kind of thing that got people reassigned, fired, or worse. No, I started with the other medical staff, figuring they'd at least share some level of professional concern. But the moment I brought it up, I felt the shift. I was in the break room, pouring myself a cup of burnt, bitter coffee when Andrea, one of the other nurses, walked in. She had been at MDC longer than me, 11 years, long enough to know how things really worked behind the scenes. She was the type who kept her head down, who didn't involve herself in prison drama or politics. But if anyone knew something, it was her. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone light, casual. "You treated Combs before, right?" She looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup. "Few times. Why?" I stirred my coffee slowly, choosing my words carefully. "Have you noticed anything strange since his last visit?" She frowned slightly. "Strange how?" I leaned in a little. Memory loss, slurred speech, weakness. Her expression barely changed, but I caught the flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition. She set her cup down. "Why are you asking?" "Because it's not normal," I exhaled. I checked his records. No history of neurological issues, no past trauma. But ever since that injection, she tensed, just for a second. I saw. "You're overthinking," she said quickly, brushing past me to the sink. Stress does things to people. This isn't stress, I pressed. She didn't answer. I lowered my voice. What was in that injection? She turned off the faucet, staring at the water swirling down the drain. Then finally, she said, "Don't ask questions you don't want the answer to." She left the room without looking back. That was the first sign. The second came later that day, when one of the guards, an older man named Davis, found me in the hallway. Davis had been working at MDC for over 20 years. He'd seen everything: politicians, drug lords, mob bosses. He never talked much, never involved himself in prison politics. But that afternoon, as I walked past the staff locker room, he suddenly called out, low enough that no one else could hear, "You don't think he knows too much?" I froze. Slowly, I turned to face him. "What?" He didn't repeat himself, just gave me a long, knowing look. "You're worried about him," he said, still quiet, almost like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "But maybe you should be worried about yourself." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice steady even though my pulse was picking up. He exhaled, glancing around the empty hallway before muttering, "Some people don't belong in prison. Some people need to disappear." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. "Disappear how?" I pressed. But he shook his head. "You didn't hear it from me." Then he walked off, leaving me standing there with my coffee growing cold in my hands. That night, the whispers started. Not from the staff, from the inmates. MDC Brooklyn had its own ecosystem of rumors, a network of voices that stretched from cell to cell, block to block. I'd heard stories before. Who was running what? Who was getting paid off? Which officers turned a blind eye to certain activities? But now, the stories were about Diddy. I was making my rounds when I caught bits and pieces of conversations between inmates. Am I messing with him? You see the way he was walking? Like he don't even know where he is. Dude's been in here barely a few months and they already breaking him. Breaking him. More like finishing him. You really think he's sick? Man, I think he's faking. Hell no, I saw him last night. He ain't faking nothing. You hear what they're saying, that it's in him. What's in him? Whatever they gave him. The conversations blurred together, mixing half-truths with paranoia. Some inmates swore he was being poisoned. Others thought he was faking it to get out of Gen Pop. And then there were the ones who muttered something far darker, that he had done something so bad, even the industry wanted him erased. By the next day, it was all anyone could talk about. I heard it from the inmates, I heard it from the lower-level staff, I even caught a CO muttering about it near the control room. That was when it hit me. This wasn't just prison gossip. Something was really happening. Something big. And I had walked straight into the middle of it. That afternoon, I saw Diddy again. He was barely standing upright as the guards escorted him back to the medical unit. His eyes had lost their sharpness. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. I led him to the chair, my mind racing. "You're not doing well," I said carefully. "You need to tell me. What did they give you?" His breath was shaky, his fingers curled into weak fists on his lap. He opened his mouth, and then, with barely enough strength to get the words out, he whispered something that made my blood run cold. "The Ma don't want me talking." My pulse jumped. I leaned closer. Who doesn't? His body shuddered, his jaw tightening as if he was fighting against something invisible. Then, even softer. It wasn't medicine. A cold wave of dread washed over me. Because I already knew that. I had known it from the moment I gave him that injection. But hearing him say it, that was something else entirely. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Davis had said. The people don't belong in prison. Some people need to disappear. I kept hearing the whispers from the inmates. It's in him, whatever they gave him. I kept seeing Diddy's face. Hollow. Unfocused. terrified. And I kept coming back to the same terrifying realization. The injection wasn't for his health. It was to silence him. Chapter 5. The incident in the middle of the night. Prison never truly sleeps. There's always noise, the shuffle of feet on concrete, the distant clank of metal doors, the occasional outburst from an inmate who couldn't keep his mouth shut past lights out. Even at its quietest, MDC Brooklyn had a pulse, a hum of restless energy running through its walls. But that night was different. It was too quiet. I had finished my shift hours ago, but I couldn't shake the unease that had been crawling under my skin since my conversation with Diddy. I had seen sick men, dying men, men trying to con their way into the infirmary for an extra meal or some painkillers, but I had never seen anything like him. His decline was unnatural, deliberate, and I had done nothing to stop it. I lay on the stiff cot in the staff rest area, staring at the ceiling, going over everything in my head. The missing medical records, the whispers in the hallway, the way other staff avoided my questions. Something wasn't adding up. Then my radio crackled to life. Medical emergency, Block C, inmate Combs, possible seizure, no movement response. I sat up so fast my head spun. I was on my feet in seconds, shoving my shoes on, heart hammering as I grabbed my medkit and rushed out of the break room. The halls were mostly empty, just a few officers patrolling, their radios silent. No alarms, no urgency. That alone felt wrong. A seizure in a high-security unit should have set off more of a response. Why wasn't anyone moving? By the time I reached the cell, my stomach was a knot of dread. I stepped through the open cell door and immediately felt the temperature shift. The room was cold, unnaturally so, the kind of cold that clings to your bones, makes the hair on your arms stand up. Diddy was on the floor, curled into himself, his body trembling in sharp, erratic spasms. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands moving automatically, checking his pulse, feeling the clammy dampness of his skin. His breathing was too shallow, his chest barely rising. His eyes were open, but unfocused, staring past me at nothing. This wasn't a normal seizure. There was no foaming at the mouth, no violent thrashing. It was controlled, almost restrained, like his body was misfiring in slow, painful waves. "Calmed," I said, shaking his shoulder lightly. "Can you hear me?" No response. One of the guards, Davis, the one who had warned me about disappearing inmates, was standing near the door, his face pale. "This ain't normal," he muttered. He was right. This was something else. I checked his pulse again. Weak. Too weak. I turned to the other guard, a younger guy who looked way too nervous for someone used to seeing inmates collapse. "What happened?" I demanded. He swallowed hard, shifting on his feet. I don't know. He was fine during count, then next thing we know, he's like this. I wasn't buying it. I wasn't buying any of it. I grabbed my flashlight and gently opened one of Diddy's eyes. His pupils were dilated. His eyelids fluttered slightly. He was still there, somewhere deep inside his own body. Then his lips moved. A whisper. At first, I couldn't hear it. I leaned closer, heart pounding. "What?" His hand jerked up suddenly, gripping my wrist with what little strength he had left. He whispered a name. The same name he had muttered before. The name I didn't recognize. I froze. My breath hitched. The way he said it, it wasn't random. It wasn't just delirium. He was trying to tell me something. But before I could ask, his grip went slack. His whole body shuddered violently, his muscles tightening so hard his back arched slightly off the floor. Then he collapsed again, completely still. I grabbed my radio. "We need a stretcher in Block C now." The guards didn't move. No one was recording this. No one was calling it in. I turned to Davis, who still hadn't stepped inside the cell. "What the hell is wrong with you? Get me a damn stretcher." He hesitated. "We ain't got records on this." I stared at him. "What?" "The logs," he said, voice low. "There ain't none. No records of his condition. No records of the injection." I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. Nothing was documented. It was like none of this was happening. My mouth was dry. My pulse was too fast. "So what, you just let him die?" Davis clenched his jaw. He was scared. I could see it in his eyes. But fear wasn't an excuse. I turned back to Diddy, trying to stabilize his breathing, trying to keep my hands steady as I checked his vitals again. His skin was colder now, his pulse barely there. This wasn't just some reaction to stress. This was something else entirely. I didn't know how much time passed before help finally arrived. 2 more officers showed up with a stretcher, moving slow, deliberate, like they weren't in a rush. Like they already knew he wasn't going to die. I watched them lift him onto the stretcher, his body limp, his breathing uneven. Then I noticed something else. One of the new guards had a clipboard in his hand, but there was nothing written on it. No report, no official statement. They were just going through the motions. Because as far as the system was concerned, this never happened. I followed them to the medical wing, keeping my distance as they transferred him into a holding room. When I tried to go inside, one of the new guards blocked me. "Doctor's orders," he said flatly. "You're off this case." I stared at him. "Excuse me? You're done." He didn't blink. I glanced past him at Diddy lying motionless on the cot. His chest was rising, but barely. "Well?" I asked, my voice quiet now. The guard shrugged. "Orders from up top." Orders. I forced myself to breathe. I had worked in this prison long enough to know what that meant. I walked away without another word. But I knew this wasn't over. Diddy had been put in that cell to disappear, and I was starting to think I had just made myself part of the problem. That night, I laid in bed staring at the ceiling again, just like the night before. But this time, I wasn't just uneasy. I was terrified. Because I finally understood what was happening. This wasn't a medical crisis. It was a cover-up, and I had just walked straight into the middle of it. Chapter 6. The paper trail that didn't exist. I barely slept. Again. The night before had replayed in my head over and over. The emergency call, the way Diddy's body convulsed on the floor, the terrified look on Davis's face when he muttered, "We ain't got records on this." That part stuck with me, because what the hell did that mean? Inmates collapsed all the time, fights broke out, people overdosed, bodies failed under stress, and every single one of those incidents got logged. No matter how minor, there was always a record. But this, it was like it never happened. And that scared me more than anything else. I showed up early for my shift, too wired to wait. I didn't even check in at the main desk. Instead, I went straight to the medical archives. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe some kind of oversight. Some missing piece of paperwork that explained everything. A clerical mistake, something I could blame on bad record keeping. Instead, I found nothing. Not a damn thing. I pulled Diddy's file from the cabinet, flipping through it fast, searching for anything that mentioned his injection, the seizure, the emergency response. All that was there? A single entry. Inmate calms, routine medical maintenance, cleared by administration. That was it. No dosage details. No record of what was injected into his bloodstream. No mention of his symptoms. No mention of his breakdown. No mention of me being called to his cell at 2:30 a.m. while he seized on the floor, like his nervous system was shutting down. My fingers clenched around the edges of the file. This wasn't negligence. This was deliberate. I shoved the file back into the cabinet and went straight for the computer. Maybe the physical logs had been altered, but the digital records wouldn't be as easy to erase. I sat down at the desk and typed in my credentials. The system pulled up the general medical reports listing all inmates who had received treatment in the past week. Diddy's name should have been at the top. It wasn't. I frowned and tried searching manually. Nothing. My pulse picked up. Then, acting on instinct, I tried accessing his full medical history. The screen flashed red. A pop-up appeared. Owls restricted. Contact administrator. I stared at it. No other inmate had this level of security on their medical records. I checked. I searched 3 random names. One guy who had been stabbed in the cafeteria, another who had overdosed on fentanyl, and a third who had a history of seizures. All of their records were open. But not Diddy's. Why? I swallowed hard, forcing my hands to stay steady. Something bigger than prison politics was happening here, and I was starting to realize just how deep this went. I logged out before someone walked in and caught me, but my mind was spinning. I needed to talk to someone, anyone. I made my way to the medical unit, looking for Andrea, the nurse I had spoken to before. She had worked at MDC long enough to know how things operated. But when I passed her in the hallway and tried to talk, she barely looked at me. "I don't have time," she muttered, brushing past me. I followed. "Andrea, wait." She turned sharply. "Drop it." Her eyes flicked around, checking for listening ears. I lowered my voice. "You saw him. You know something's wrong." She exhaled through her nose, pressing her lips together. "I also know when to mind my own business." I stared at her. "Why are you scared?" She shook her head. "I'm not scared. I'm smart." Then she walked away. I spent the next few hours trying to get answers from anyone who would talk. No one did. Not directly. But the silence said everything. Every single medical assistant, nurse, guard, and administrator I approached refused to engage. Some muttered weak excuses. Others didn't bother speaking at all. And the worst part, I could feel them watching me. Like they were waiting to see if I'd keep pushing. Like they knew I was walking too close to the edge of something I wasn't supposed to see. It wasn't until my lunch break that I finally got something. I was walking past the file storage room when one of the younger medical assistants, Paul, bumped into me. It was intentional. I barely had time to react before he shoved something into my hand and kept walking, disappearing down the hall without a word. I looked down. A folded slip of paper. My stomach twisted as I unfolded it. One sentence. "Was never supposed to talk." The words stared back at me. I stared back at them. A cold, nauseating feeling settled in my gut. What did that mean? Who didn't want him to talk? What did he know? And why the hell were they erasing him? I finished my shift without saying another word. I didn't push. I didn't ask more questions. I needed time to think. I needed to figure out what my next move was. Because I was in too deep now. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I even had a way out. That night I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the note again, turning the words over in my mind. Was never supposed to talk. Not he wasn't supposed to live. Not he was never supposed to be here. He was never supposed to talk. Something about that phrasing sent a chill down my spine. Because it meant Diddy knew something. Something so dangerous, so damning, that someone, maybe multiple people, had gone through extraordinary lengths to make sure he stayed silent. Maybe the rumors were right. Maybe this wasn't just about prison politics or industry revenge. Maybe this was bigger. And if that was true, then I had just made myself a problem. Because I was the only one still asking questions. And I had a feeling that meant I was next. Chapter 7. The unexpected transfer. By the time I clocked in the next morning, I had already decided to be careful. I had spent the night going over everything in my head, trying to piece together the puzzle, the missing records, the restricted medical files, the assistant's note. He was never supposed to talk, but mostly I kept thinking about Diddy, about the way his body betrayed him, the sudden collapse, the tremors that weren't quite seizures but something else, the way he whispered that name again, the one I still couldn't make sense of. I knew something was happening to him, and I knew whoever was behind it wasn't done yet. When I walked into the medical unit that morning, I expected to find him still there, hooked up to monitors, still weak, still trembling like a man caught in his own failing body. But his bed was empty. The room looked untouched, sheets neatly folded, no sign that a critically ill inmate had been there just hours ago. My chest tightened. I turned to the nearest medical officer. "Where's Combs?" The guy barely glanced up from his clipboard. "Not here." "No shit," I snapped. He shrugged, flipping a page like I hadn't just asked a serious question. "Transferred." My stomach dropped. "Transferred where?" This time, he paused, just for a second. "Don't know." I knew a lie when I heard one. I stormed down the hall to find Green, my supervisor. His door was half open and I didn't even bother knocking. "Where's Combs?" Green looked up from his desk, not the least bit surprised to see me. "Routine transfer," he said, voice flat. "Administrative decision." "What the hell does that mean?" "It means..." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple like I was wasting his time. "We don't owe you an explanation. You've been reassigned." I blinked. "What?" "You're covering Block E now," he said, already turning back to his paperwork. "Report to duty in 20 minutes. Just like that, like I wasn't even supposed to question it. "You're pulling me for medical?" "Not permanently." He glanced up, expression unreadable. "Just a shift adjustment." "Oh, bullshit." This wasn't about my shift. This was about keeping me away from Diddy. I clenched my jaw. What's happening to him? Green sighed, like I was annoying him now. "Listen, you're a good nurse," he said, like he was trying to pacify me. "But sometimes you ask too many questions. Not everything is your business." I wasn't backing down. "Who was too weak for a transfer?" I shot back. "He could barely walk 2 days ago. How the hell does he suddenly qualify for general population?" For the first time, Green hesitated. It was quick, a flicker of something in his expression, but I caught it. And it confirmed everything I already suspected. This wasn't normal. Diddy wasn't supposed to get better. He was supposed to disappear. I spent the rest of the morning pretending to work in Block E, but my mind was stuck on Diddy. I knew the official transfer story was bullshit, so I started asking around. Quietly, carefully. But every time I brought up his name, I got the same reaction. Blank stares, shrugs. Or worse, quick, nervous glances, like I had just asked something I shouldn't have. One of the younger COs, a guy named Ramirez, gave me the most honest answer I'd gotten all day. I caught him near the vending machines, far from the security cameras. "But where's Combs?" I asked. He hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he muttered, "General population." I folded my arms. "That's a lie." Ramirez swallowed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's what they told us." I stepped closer. "But you don't believe it?" His jaw tightened. He didn't answer. "Where is he, Ramirez?" He looked around, then lowered his voice even more. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know he's not in Gen Pop." A chill ran through me. "You saw the way he was," I pressed. "You really think they just threw him in with the rest of the inmates? He'd be dead in a day." Ramirez exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Look, all I know is his name was on the transfer list, but when I checked the log, I felt my pulse pick up." "What?" His eyes flicked toward the hallway, like he was making sure no one else was listening. His name was on the list, he repeated, but there was no destination. I stilled. That wasn't normal. That wasn't normal at all. Every transfer had a record, where the inmate was going, what block they were assigned to. Even temporary holding units had logs. But Ramirez was telling me Diddy's transfer had no destination. It was a paper moved, which meant Diddy wasn't transferred. He was taken. I pushed further. I went back to the officer's station, scanning the inmate logs. Just like Ramirez said, Diddy's name was there. And just like Ramirez said, there was no final location. He had been checked out of medical. Then, nothing. Just empty space where his new assignment should have been. Like he had been removed from the system entirely. I tried one last time. I went to the warden's office. I knew it was a long shot, but I needed someone in power to acknowledge that this wasn't normal. Instead, I got the warden's assistant, a woman named Monroe. She was sitting at her desk, typing away at a report, when I stepped in. She didn't even look up. "You have an appointment? I need to talk to the warden." She finally glanced at me, unimpressed. "About what?" "Inmate transfer," I said, calms. Something flickered in her expression. She knew. I could see it. "That's classified," she said, turning back to her computer. Classified. That was the word she used. Not private, not restricted. Classified. Like he wasn't a prisoner. Like he was a case. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Where is he?" She typed another sentence. "I'm his medical provider," I said sharply. "I have the right to know where he is." She stopped typing. Slowly, she looked at me. Then she leaned forward. "If you want to keep your job," she said quietly, "you didn't see anything." I swallowed hard. "Is he still alive?" I asked, barely above a whisper. Her lips pressed together. "You need to go." I left the office with a hollow feeling in my chest. Diddy was gone. Not transferred. Not in general population. Not anywhere I could find. And no one was going to ask questions. Because this was intentional. And if I wasn't careful, I might be next. Chapter 8. The last thing I saw. Weeks passed, and I did what I was supposed to do. I kept my mouth shut. I went to work. I followed the new assignment they gave me in Block E, and I stopped asking questions about Diddy. I stopped checking the logs, stopped looking for his name, stopped watching for signs of him in the cafeteria or the infirmary or the exercise yard. I did everything I could to pretend that he had never been here, just like they wanted. But the truth never really leaves you, not when it's buried inside your chest like a ticking bomb, waiting for the right moment to detonate. I felt it every time I walked past the empty infirmary bed where he should have been. I felt it when I saw a new inmate take his place, as if he had never even existed. I felt it every time I caught a guard looking at me just a little too long, like they were waiting to see if I was going to make trouble. They had erased him. Not killed, not transferred, erased. And no one gave a damn. The prison moved on, the inmates moved on, the system swallowed him whole. I told myself to move on too. But then, one afternoon I saw him. I was walking through one of the back corridors of the medical wing, a section I wasn't even supposed to be in anymore. It was part of the restricted unit, a place most inmates never ended up unless they were waiting for high-security transfers, placed in solitary, or being held under administrative lockdown. I wasn't even thinking about him when I passed by the heavy metal door that led into that wing. I was just going about my day, head down, avoiding unnecessary attention. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure sitting in the dimly lit holding area. Something about the way they sat, stiff, lifeless, hollow, made me stop. I turned my head slightly, glancing through the small, reinforced glass window. And there he was. Diddy? Or at least, what was left of him. He was sitting alone on a metal bench, hands resting on his knees, fingers twitching every few seconds like he was trying to grab onto something that wasn't there. His clothes hung off of him like they belonged to someone twice his size. He had lost even more weight. His skin was almost gray under the harsh fluorescent lighting. But his face, that was the worst part. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead, not at the wall, through it, like there was nothing left inside him. He didn't blink when an officer shouted nearby, didn't flinch when another inmate was dragged past him, screaming curses at the guards. Nothing. No reaction. It was like he wasn't there anymore. I don't know how long I stood there. It felt like time had slowed, like the entire prison had faded away except for the two of us, separated by a few feet of concrete and reinforced glass. The last time I had seen him, he had been fighting against something invisible, something eating him from the inside out. Now the fight was gone. His body was still here, but Diddy wasn't. The man who once controlled the music industry, the man who built an empire off power, wealth, and excess. He wasn't even a person anymore, just a ghost wearing a body. I didn't even realize I had stopped breathing until I felt my chest tighten. Then, as if some part of him had sensed me standing there, his fingers twitched again. Slowly, painfully, his head turned just slightly. Not toward me. Not toward anything, really. Just slightly. Like his body was reacting before his mind could process it. I should have walked away then. I should have kept moving, should have let it go, just like I had promised myself I would. But I didn't, because I saw something else. A faint, almost imperceptible movement, his lips parting. Not much, barely a whisper of motion, but it was enough. For a second I thought he was going to say something. Thought maybe, somehow, he was still in there. But before anything could happen, before any sound could come out, the door to the restricted unit swung open and a guard stepped into my line of vision. I snapped my head forward, pretending I had just been passing by. "Something I can help you with?" the guard asked, his tone flat, uninterested. I shook my head. No, just heading back to the main unit. The guard stared at me for a second too long, like he was trying to figure out if I was lying. Then he nodded, stepping aside. I forced myself to walk away. I didn't look back. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But I knew better. Because if I looked back, I might never look away again. And I couldn't afford to be caught staring. I made it back to my station, forced my body to go through the motions of work. Charting, administering meds, signing off reports, like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just seen what I had seen, but the image stayed with me. Diddy, sitting alone, staring into nothing. His body still breathing, but his soul long gone. I realized then, whatever they had done to him, it wasn't an accident. It was a method, a process, and it had worked. They had taken the most powerful man in the room, the man who once controlled everything, and turned him into nothing. Diddy had spent decades pulling the strings, shaping the world around him, making and breaking careers, holding power over people's lives. But now someone had taken control of him, and no one would ever know the truth, because no one was supposed to. I don't know how much longer I lasted at MDC Brooklyn after that. A few months, maybe less. I got out eventually. I told myself I left because I was tired of the job, because the stress wasn't worth the paycheck anymore. That's what I told everyone. But the real reason? I left because I saw what happens when you ask too many questions. I left because I knew if I kept digging, if I kept pushing, if I kept looking too long at things I wasn't supposed to see, I might end up just like him. Silent, forgotten, erased. And I wasn't going to let that happen to me. So I walked away. But I never forgot. And I never will. Because I know, even if no one else does, Diddy didn't just lose himself in prison. He was taken. And no one will ever find him again. Not really. Not after what they did. And that was the last thing I saw.